This episode is sponsored by Boxu. More to come on that shortly. So, Crofty, it's been a while, hasn't it?
Yes, it's been since Halloween, I think, since we recorded.
Yeah, unfortunately, not only did we manage to run to a two-parter last time, but then I got myself really busy with some projects. So, hello to everybody. Welcome back to Mythological after what was a slightly longer break than I had planned this time. But hopefully we won't be doing anywhere near that much of a break again. So, welcome back to Crofty, my co-host. I'm, of course, Charles, and today we've got something kind of interesting prepared for you, haven't we, Crofty?
Yes, in a change to our originally scheduled programming, we have decided to pick a slightly larger topic, which we're hoping isn't a mistake.
It very well could be, knowing us, but we'll roll with it. We'll see. We might hit a three-parter for the first time at the rate we're going, but
please no.
Please no. We'll be here recording till like midnight.
Shall I introduce the topic?
Yes. So, Crofty, you picked this one, didn't you?
Yes, I picked a topic related to a country that I am very interested in.
Yeah, Crofty, would you or would you not describe yourself as a weeb?
I think some people would describe me as that, yes.
Yeah, because you've not only have you been to the country in question, you've also have interests in learning the language of that place.
Hi. That's the only word I know. Nah. Kuchi o hirake nakatara atamagi to omoimasu. If I hadn't opened my mouth, you might have thought I was clever.
Yeah, some authentic Italian there from Crofty.
It's Latin.
So today's topic is Japanese yokai. And I probably already said that wrong.
I think you got it close enough. Yokai.
Yokai, yeah. So we're struggling with the elongated O sound there, aren't we? Or the long, is it the long vowel?
Yes, the long vowels in Japanese. So if we do make that mistake, please forgive us. If we make the mistake of struggling with double consonants, which when talking about things such as Kappa, we are definitely going to give up on, please forgive us for that.
People have heard our attempts at Welsh. I think the damage is already done at this point, Crofty.
Yeah. If I've not been kicked out of Wales for my attempts at Welsh yet, then I think our Japanese will be all right.
So today's episode was interesting to me, Crofty, in doing the research because I knew next to nothing about yokai. I have maybe a few references to it through just elements of Japanese popular culture that I have accidentally run across, but until you said the word, I had never heard of it.
Yes, it's an interesting one in that it's both very widespread throughout Japanese history and throughout the country itself today, but also the word was quite a recent one entering common knowledge, and the things that it covers are probably some of the most varied creatures that we have covered so far in this podcast, and probably the most varied creatures we will ever cover in this podcast.
Yeah, I'm slightly worried that we have bitten off another dragons, where we're doing a vast array of different creatures that all happen to fall under an individual banner, but I think we've taken some measures to prevent us going on endlessly, haven't we? We've somewhat restricted exactly what we're going to be covering today.
Yes, fortunately, with the yokai, we can sort of follow the progression of them through time, how Japanese people changed their perceptions of them from the 7th century to now. And then we can sort of categorize a few of the major yokai within mythology and folklore that will be well known to people. So it's not going to be as all over the place as Dragons was.
Yep. Hopefully it will be a bit more structured. So, Crofty, I should probably start by asking, what are yokai?
Well,
it's a complicated answer, isn't it?
Yes. It refers to quite a wide variety of supernatural creatures throughout ancient Japanese mythology right up to modern urban legends and everything in between. It's often acts as a sort of catch-all term for anything supernatural that's not explicitly a kami, which is a Shinto equivalent for god, though, as we'll see, kami are also sort of lesser gods and benevolent spirits.
Yeah, the way it was explained to me is a kami is kind of any entity or object that's really considered worthy of worship.
Yes, in fact, a mountain can be a kami. For example, Mount Fuji, Fuji-san, or Mount Takao, Takao-san. The mountain itself is considered a kami, but also the spirit of the mountain is also considered the kami. It's very dual nature. And yokai do have that same sort of dual nature at times, but more darkly. So there are inanimate objects that become sentient, and the spirit that possesses them can be considered a yokai or the object itself. Similarly, certain yokai might originally have been just a formless evil spirit that later on became a distinct creature.
Yeah. So in English translations, I'm trying to give some aids here to our potential listeners because it is a difficult concept to grasp, as you just said, and it can vary depending on situations. So in English translations, often yokai are equated with creatures such as just monsters, spirits, demons, phantoms, as you said, lower tier gods and kami, fantastical beings. And also, I think, especially in their early history, they were kind of equated with simply any unexplainable experience.
Yes, that is about right. In fact, the kanji for yokai, the first kanji can mean bewitching, it can also mean attractive, it can also mean calamity. It's quite a variation there. And the second kanji can mean spectre or mystery or simply suspicious. So even the word itself does cover quite a variety of different objects, creatures, or situations in that way.
Yeah, I think the way I kind of reconcile it overall in my mind is, to me, yokai are any type of basic supernatural force or creature where you're not really supposed to fully understand their nature.
Yes. In fact, there's some scholars who do say that once you start to try and define what yokai are, they do start to lose some of what makes them yokai by taking the mystery out of them.
Yeah, and we will see that as well when we come to more historical discussions of them. That is effectively a process that has been going on for a long time, the kind of demystification around them.
So we may be on a bit of a fool's errand trying to define the undefinable here.
Yeah.
But
well, I must admit, as stories go, I kind of prefer when you have that sort of entity rather than something which is directly explained. I think to use a very Western example, is it the Stephen King example they gave of where a writer could be building up that there's definitely a horrible bug hidden behind this door and he's 100 feet tall and he's going to be horrible and you're going to be really disgusted. Then you open the door and there's the 100 feet bug and you just go, wow, I'm glad he wasn't 200 feet tall. Yokai kind of get around that by not having such a concrete definition or description.
Are we going to get Stephen King fans getting angry at us now?
Yeah, the things we could say about Dear Stephen, but I think we shouldn't.
I mean, I love his work, but
yeah.
But I do also see your point at the same time.
Moving along, now that we've alienated most of our audience, Crofty, what I think we'd planned for today is when it comes to categorizing and going through all the different types of yokai out there, it's something of a fool's errand. There are so many different diverse types who feature in so many diverse stories that we could be here for possibly 100 hours or more trying to go through a definitive list.
I think one or two fans would be okay with that, but...
Yeah, probably not the ones we want to listen to, though, to be honest. But what I think would be better for us to do today would be instead to go through more of a historical breakdown of how yokai first appeared, how they evolved over time, how they have kind of appeared in print from the 17th century, like in more defined forms in print from the 17th century onwards. And then we're just going to have a bit of a grab bag and look at some of the major categories of yokai, very similar to how we did the Baba Yaga stories.
That does sound like the best way for us to proceed with such a massive topic.
Yeah, definitely. But before we do so, Crofty, I just want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor. So, Crofty, I've heard that you're a fan of Japanese teas and snacks.
I do have an entire cupboard dedicated to them, yes.
Okay, Crofty, I'm going to... you're under oath here, of course. That's the podcasting rules. So, Crofty, I've heard it's not just a cupboard. I've heard it is, in fact, several cupboards.
Well, it started out as a cupboard and they kept sort of multiplying and now taking over my kitchen. I think there's actually a yokai haunting my kitchen, hoarding more and more of these snacks and teas, or magically making them multiply. I'm not sure. I'm quite scared. Please send an exorcist.
Yes, it's very mysterious, very unknowable. But what I think is actually happening, Crofty, is that you are hoarding Japanese snacks with the uncertain fate of the world. And I'm here today to tell you that there is a better way. And that's because today's episode is sponsored by Boxu. If, like Crofty, you're a fan of Japanese culture, you'll definitely want to try Boxu, the monthly subscription service that delivers a gourmet assortment of delicious Japanese snacks and tea pairings right to your door. Every month you get a new box with a completely different theme that will allow you to experience the authentic taste of the different regions, events and traditions of Japan. Boxu sources handcrafted snacks and specially selected teas from local and family-run businesses all around Japan, some over 200 years old, providing you with a unique mix of traditional and modern Japanese foods. You'll also get a complete cultural guide telling you the origin, ingredients and allergens of each and every product. Boxes are shipped directly from Japan, and when you order, you'll receive your first box in 1 to 2 weeks. So to get 10% off your authentic Japanese snack box from Boxu, click on the link in the description below and save up to $47 using the code Histocrat10. Boxu, start your gourmet journey through Japan today. Before we begin, we should of course start by citing our sources. So my main sources for today's episode were, I started off, which Crofty, you actually linked this to me, which was very much appreciated, with a rundown of the yokai and their place in history, which is actually a student honours thesis by Brandon Michael Howard, a yokai parade through time in Japan. So I recommend that as a good starting point, just as a breakdown of the yokai as a whole and how they evolved over time. However, my main resources for today's episode were what I think we have to say are easily the most authoritative sources in English on the yokai. These are the dual books written by Michael Dillon Foster, Pandemonium and Parade, Japanese Monsters and the Culture of the Yokai. And in addition to this, he also has a book which continues some of the traditions we're going to be talking about later in this episode and how yokai were categorized, which is the Book of Yokai. Not only does that go into yokai history, it also gives you a look into the wider world of different types and categories of yokai. Crofty, over to you.
So, in addition to the Foster books and to a yokai parade through Japan, I also managed to find a translation of the Kojiki, which was the original book of Japanese mythology from the 8th century, translated by Donald L. Philippi. I also used another master's thesis, The Evolution of Yokai in Relationship to the Japanese Horror Genre by Adam J. Johnson. A few other papers such as Shaping Darkness in the Hyaki Yagyo Imaki by Raluca Nikolai, as well as Tsuchigumo Zoshi, The Emergence of the Shape-Shifting Killer Female Spider by Noriko T. Rader.
Okay, Crofty, now that we have sort of divvied around the topic as to exactly how yokai are defined, maybe it's time for us to get into where they first originated, what our earliest records we have of these entities are.
Yes. So the earliest records actually go back to some of the first books published in Japan, in particular the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, which were from the year 712 and 720, respectively. So this is what's known as the Nara period of Japan, where the imperial capital was in the city of Nara, which is now famous for quite a large deer park and the biggest Buddha statue in the world. So some of you might have heard of the city. At this time, the imperial court ordered that Japanese history up till that time would be categorized, would be written out in a standard form that could be saved to records. And that was what led to the writing and the publication of the Kojiki, which was an attempt to categorize both the history and all of the local legends that were spread throughout Japan. And this was where the word first appeared in Japan. The kanji that I mentioned earlier did appear in China in the first century with a similar meaning, but obviously with a different pronunciation behind them. So in the Kojiki, the term referred to yokai as appearing at the imperial court and needing purification rituals by Shinto or Buddhist priests in order to be expelled from the court. But apart from that, the word almost never appeared before the 19th century.
Yeah.
And until that point, they were instead called either by their specific names, which we'll go into in a bit, or if they didn't have or a specific name wasn't known for them at the time, there were words such as mononoke, which literally means mysterious thing or mysterious spirit, bakemono, which means changing thing or shapeshifter, and a certain class of them were also known as Tsukumogami, which specifically refers to inanimate objects that would come alive. Though for this episode, for convenience, we will just be using the term yokai throughout, rather than trying to keep the historical term. It makes it a bit easier for us going forward.
Yeah, it's a bit more consistent, and I think we may have those terms crop up occasionally then, but generally we will try to refer to them as yokai.
Yeah, or by the specific name where relevant.
Mm-hmm.
So, the earliest monsters that can be considered to be yokai were actually an integral part of the Shinto creation myths that were told in both the Kojiki and later updated for the Nihon Shoki. For hundreds of years previously, they'd been told through oral tradition and through Shinto priests to their followers, before finally being written down at this time. The Kojiki version tells of the god and goddess Izanagi and Izanami. They were born from the original 5 heavenly deities who created the universe, and they'd been tasked with creating the land of Japan. So together they birthed 14 islands, followed by 35 gods that inhabited them. And after bearing the final god, the fire deity Kagutsuchi. Yeah. I'm meant to be studying Japanese, and my teacher is going to be so ashamed of me. I hope she's not listening. After giving birth to the fire god, Izanami died. In his grief, Izanagi beheaded the fire god with his sword before descending into the underworld called Yomi in order to bring his wife back. When he finds her, he begs her to return with him to finish their work, but she tells him she's already eaten food from the hearth of Yomi and must ask permission from the gods of Yomi, and while she does so, he must not look upon her. But Izanagi gets impatient while she's gone. He lights a torch, enters the chamber of the gods of Yomi, and by breaking this taboo, he then sees Izanami as a maggot-riddled corpse, with her body also writhing with 8 thunder deities that were born within her as well. Izanagi flees from this, because he's quite naturally terrified of this image, and Izanami declares that he has shamed her, and she sends the hags of Yomi, or the Yomotsu Shikome, in pursuit of him. So these can be considered the first yokai. They are pretty much demons of hell, and are described as old hags, quite similar to yokai that we will be seeing later, and that might sound familiar to listeners of previous episodes of this podcast.
Yeah, anyone who listened to our Baba Yaga episode, you're getting a call back.
Yeah. After Izanagi stops these hags of Yomi, which he does by throwing down the comb that he had in his hair, which creates a forest of bamboo, which they stop and eat, which also sounds familiar from a few previous episodes. Izanagi then sends the thunder deities that she birthed after him, as well as the warriors of Yomi, which can be considered to be the first Oni, which we will also cover more about later.
Yep.
He defeats these Oni with his sword and also by using 3 peaches as weapons, which the book doesn't really go into on how that works, but these 3 peaches are also integral to him defeating them somehow. After this, he and Izanami break their vows, and he seals Izanami in the underworld. She vows that she will choke the life from 1,000 humans a day, while he vows that he will create 1,500 humans a day. And so they then become responsible for humans' mortality, and also were used to explain why the population increases over time. So the Hags of Yomi and the Warriors of Yomi can be seen as precursors to quite common yokai that we will see later, whereas Izanami herself sort of fits the archetype that we were talking about before of a presence that is used to explain certain phenomena. In this case, she is used to explain why humans die. So in some ways, she fits some of the criteria that we discussed as what would make a yokai. Following this, we then get into more human exploits against yokai. So later on in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, they start to fit more standard monster tropes that we might know from Western mythology. So, for example, the dragon Yamata no Orochi, who we discussed in Dragons 2,
Yep, call back again.
is often classified as an early yokai. Though his size, as he was said to extend over the space of 8 hills and 8 valleys, isn't really consistent with the yokai that we'll become familiar with later. He does share a notable trait in that he has a very significant connection with the natural world, despite his antagonism to humans, because he was described as having fir and cypress trees growing from his back. And this connection with living trees is another common trait that we see in quite a few later yokai. While this story, as we discussed several episodes back, focuses on a god slaying a dragon, and is generally the prototype for legends of yokai slayers that we see later.
Yeah.
We then do also see myths of human yokai slayers at this stage. In particular, the legendary Emperor Caico, who was thought to reign between the years 71 and 130. When he was conquering all of the islands of Japan, when he was conquering specifically the island of Kyushu, in the south of Japan, he was said to have slain a giant earth spider called a Sujigumo, or several of these earth spiders, depending on which version. However, in this case, the name and the appearance is actually thought to be a derogatory term for the natives of Kyushu, who are ruled by female chieftains and who resisted the emperor's rule.
Yeah, this is an early appearance, Crofty, isn't it, of this? We will talk about this much, much later, but this is an early appearance of kind of yokai being used to other another people or to justify their conquest in some ways.
Yes, and it does become common as we go forward. And in this case, it is also partly just by virtue of the fact that they were opposing the emperor, the child of heaven. And so they, by refusing the rule of the emperor, they automatically become considered demons or evil. And so that then means that they get this full treatment of becoming monsters, or yokai in this case. So later on in the Nihon Shoki, we also get the first mentions of certain yokai that will become much more prominent around the Edo period, or slightly prior to the Edo period, in the Kamakura. These include some that you may have heard of, such as Tanuki, the shape-shifting raccoons, Hitsune, shape-shifting foxes, and Ningyo, which are quite similar to the Western mermaid.
Yeah, it's sometimes just referred outright to as the Japanese mermaid.
Yeah. As well as water creatures that some think might be precursors to the Kappa. These creatures, in some cases, were seen as evil water serpents, called Mizuchi, and were thought to be behind drownings and poisonings in some rivers, but they were also thought to be the same beings that Buddhists referred to as the Suijin, which inhabited the same bodies of water and shared a lot of characteristics with the Mizuchi and with the Kappa, but they were instead revered and given offerings in order to keep the waters calm and keep the fields irrigated.
Yeah, so this is kind of like, again, a yokai that's also kind of a kami in some ways.
Yeah, and it's sort of the first example, I think, of the good or evil nature of the yokai being entirely dependent on how humans saw them, where they saw them as something to be feared or something to be worshipped and given offerings to that would help them if treated right. And that becomes another quite common theme as we go forward. Moving on from the Nara period and the Nihon Shoki, we move into the Heian period, which is from the year 797 onwards. This is where the capital of Japan moved to Kyoto, which is where it remained until the 1800s. And again, we're still in quite an early, peaceful and united period of Japan. At this point, it's sort of where the emperor still held power. Then we get to the point where there's sort of a regency by one of the higher up families and then the warring states. This period was where we first started to see publication of books of more local mythology and folklore, books that were known as Setsua, which refers to spoken stories and records a lot of oral traditions and contain legends from throughout Japan, as well as the Fudoki, which were more regional texts. The oldest collection of these, the oldest Setsua, was called the Nihon Ryoiki, and it was written between 787 and 824. And this is where the Kitsune and the Tanuki mythology first gets fleshed out, where we start to see the Kitsune cast as women who could shapeshift into foxes and would either seduce human men or fall in love with human men. And so the stories there ranged from simple love stories to stories of men being lured away from their families. Tanuki also became more common and tended to be seen as shapeshifters, but generally appearing as cheerful monks and more humorous characters, though often their tricks backfire and don't end particularly well for them. And we also saw variants of the Tanuki, such as the Mujina, which resembles a Japanese badger, but otherwise fulfills quite a similar role to the Tanuki. As well as this, at this time we start to see examples of more mundane creatures or mundane things becoming yokai. One notable example is where a human became a yokai and then later on became a kami. Like we discussed earlier at the start, these can be interchangeable depending on how people saw them. And in this case, the story is still remembered today and the kami is still revered today. This figure was a scholar and a poet called Sugawara no Michinaze, who is a historical figure. There were court records of him. He was born in 845 and became a scholar at the imperial court. However, he got banished to a remote part of Kyushu, and until his death in 903, he was very resentful of this. Following his death, it was said that he became an onryo, or a vengeful spirit, and it was said that storms and floods around the capital at the time were due to him trying to get his revenge. So the emperor ordered priests and onmyoji, who are diviners or geomancers, to perform an exorcism. After this exorcism was performed, Michinaze's spirit then transformed into a kami, and the storms ended, and from then on he became worshipped as Tenjin-sama, the kami of learning. And to this day, students still attend shrines to pray to Tenjin-sama for good exam results. The most famous of those shrines being in the Ueno district of Tokyo, quite close to Tokyo University, and which appears in quite a lot of Japanese popular culture surrounding Tenjin, surrounding Shinto worship, or just surrounding students.
One thing you mentioned there, Crofty, so obviously that's another good example of a vengeful yokai being turned into a kami through outside actions and worship. One thing I think might be worth mentioning there as well, Crofty, is something which we haven't really touched on. So you were saying there's a greater incidence of humans and other things becoming yokai in stories from around this period. I think we should also mention that there are examples of many different objects seemingly could become a yokai over time. So one recurring motif that we will see going forward is, even when it comes to things like household objects or simple animals, if these animals or objects manage to reach the age of 100, many of them were then considered to possibly have been transformed into yokai.
Yes, that's correct. These objects were known as Tsukumogami, which literally translates as a tool kami. So it did tend to be attributed to craftsmen's tools mainly, or artistic tools, musical instruments, but it could be applied to pretty much any inanimate object. If it was well cared for and lasted for 100 years, it was believed that it would gain a soul, according to the Shinto tradition. And while in many cases these items were benevolent, especially if they had been very well cared for, passed down through the generations of a family, and so they were revered as heirlooms, there were cases where these items would act as pranksters, or where they would actively harm people, and so they required exorcising by Shinto or Buddhist priests of the time. That idea does reveal a part of Shinto and Buddhist and larger Japanese culture in the way that throughout history, Japanese people have been known for taking very good care of their property, but very good care of tools, instruments, craft supplies, anything. Even when those items weren't particularly needed anymore, they were still taken good care of, so that if somebody else were to need them, they could be passed on and used again. And that sort of attitude, I understand, does persist to this day. So while in these two cases, case of Tenjin-sama or the case of inanimate objects becoming yokai or kami, there is a positive ending to a lot of these stories. Tenjin-sama becomes worshipped as a god of learning, and a lot of the Tsukumogami are treated as heirlooms and are kept by the families. People becoming yokai and objects becoming yokai can also turn quite negative. There was one novel of the time that also became a play and is thought to be based on mythology of the time, called The Tale of Genji, in which a noblewoman called Lady Rokujo, after being widowed, becomes resentful over her lost status and the unwillingness of the lead character, the nobleman Genji, to help her regain her status and return her affections. And while she is still alive, her jealousy and her resentment separate from her and become a vengeful spirit, which haunts Genji and his family and kills his wife. And even after she dies, her spirit doesn't rest until her daughter performs a proper memorial service. And in this case, unlike Tenjin, there's no transformation into a kami. It is just that she finally finds peace. And similarly, when there were, with Tsukumogami, objects that had been poorly treated or damaged, they were the objects that tended to become overtly evil. So the idea of a mortal or a regular object or a regular animal becoming a yokai, again, whether it becomes an evil yokai or whether it becomes a good kami, is entirely dependent on how others treated it. And this is, again, quite a common view that pops up as we go more into the yokai. I've said that like 4 times.
Well, it just is the case. There are quite a large number of running themes when it comes to yokai.
Yeah, so that is a very good illustration of one of these running themes. At this stage, I will make a little historical note before we move into the next period, the Kamakura period of Japanese history. During the Nara period and the early Heian period, like I say, it was quite a peaceful time within Japan. Prior to the Nara period, Japan had been allied with one of the 3 kingdoms in Korea during the wars of the 3 kingdoms over there. And after the end of those wars, the Japanese forces returned to Japan. Japan became peaceful and unified. Japan at that time also maintained very good trade relations with China and with Southeast Asia, and maintained a standing army rather than being ruled by warlords and samurai, as we'll see later.
Yeah.
The ruling class were generally courtiers. They were wealthy aristocrats rather than warriors. And so while it may be just chance that from my research, I'm only finding these stories of either smaller, harmful yokai or more peaceful yokai, and not finding many stories of violence at this point. I do wonder if there's a connection between the fact that it was quite a peaceful era and the fact that the stories generally didn't have the large violence that we were seeing later on as changes in the political makeup of Japan that are quite well known and we'll go into in a moment happened.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised myself either if that was the case, because I do know from the later periods that I'm going to cover that often, and also just generally from history, often when you get a prolonged period of peace, you tend to see things like increased population growth, increased cultural and technological growth, and it doesn't surprise me that then we start to see these greater incidents of stories coming out during such a period of peace.
Yes. Whereas when we see a more country that's moving more towards civil war, then the fears of the people do naturally influence their stories. And so it may well be that the more violent mythology that we go into later was quite heavily influenced just by that attitude at the time. So, let's move on to the earliest stage of this more violent mythology. The later years of the Heian period, we're getting towards the end of the 10th century at this stage. Stories of yokai slayers started to become more common. In particular, there were two historical figures who would later become revered as yokai slayers. The first was Abe no Seimei. He was the head of the Imperial Bureau of Divination and thought to be a sorcerer. And the second was Minamoto no Yorimitsu, who was a warrior from the Seiwa Genji clan. In the case of Abe no Seimei, he was a practitioner of Onmyodo, or an Onmyoji. These were considered to be diviners and to have earth-related magic, and they acted as astrologers, meteorologists, and diviners for the imperial court. And this led people at the time perceiving them as powerful wizards and attributing to them magical abilities that could be used to kill yokai and to even kill humans. In reality, Seimei himself was essentially a civil servant or a bureaucrat, and he rose through the ranks in order to become the director of the Bureau of Divination. However, the legend that got built around him cast him as the son of a human man and a kitsune woman, and that was how he was thought to inherit his strong magical powers, by being part of the human and supernatural worlds. And it was said that he was able to command 12 familiars called Shikigami, who were described as demonic figures similar to the Oni that we'll get into later, but they were bound to the will of their master rather than being more chaotic and evil. And so again, another example of the ambiguous nature of yokai, in that they could be bound to a person in order to do good.
I think that what you said, Crofty, is the first example I've heard of where a human kind of getting the upper hand in a long-term fashion over a yokai.
Yeah, it was the first example that I found as well, and probably the most famous of the time at least. The other yokai slayer, Minamoto no Yorimitsu, who was also known as Raiko, was thought to complement the mystical abilities of Seimei by being an exceptional warrior. Historically, he originally served the Fujiwara clan, who at this stage had become regents in Kyoto and sort of the power behind the throne, as it were. And Yorimitsu acted as their enforcer and hitman originally, before being given the governorship of Izu province, which is a peninsula about halfway between modern-day Tokyo and modern-day Nagoya. After that, he served as a commander in the Imperial Guard before becoming the Secretary of the Ministry of War. So it's likely that at that time he came into contact with Seimei, as they both served at high levels of government, and likely that out of that association was where the legends of the pair of them as a team of yokai slayers grew from. He did also have several solo adventures, with one that I feel we should go into at this time. He and his retainers were lured to an old house which was filled with several yokai, including a 290-year-old woman, a 60-foot-tall Oni, a kitsune, a number of animated Tsukumogami, and finally, he encountered one of the giant earth spiders, the Tsuchigomo, that Emperor Caico was thought to have fought. In this particular picture scroll, where this was recounted, which was called the Tsuchigumo Zoshi, dates from the 14th century, and unlike the earlier appearances of Tsuchigumo, there's no real evidence to suggest that they were being used as a metaphor for any human groups. Instead, it's simply a monster for the brave hero to slay.
Yeah.
So we can see, even at this stage, evolution of some of the first yokai into forms that fit more with the way the legends worked at this time. Around this time period, so from the 12th century onwards, start of the Kamakura period of Japanese history, is also where we begin to see Oni and Tengu become more common in yokai lore. These are probably two of the most well-known today. They appear quite often in video games, anime, manga.
It was that sort of route that I'd heard most of them from. I didn't realise that they were part of this wider category, but that's kind of where my initial knowledge of some of these came from. And I have a good example for one of them later.
Yeah, same for me. I think I have a few examples for both later on, but we'll save that. So, both of them at the time were mostly depicted as evil creatures. Oni were a type of demon or ogre. They were large, brutish, with horned heads, generally carrying an iron club and just wearing a loincloth.
Yeah, tiger skin loincloth.
Yep, that's right. While precursors to them did appear in the creation myths, like I mentioned earlier, and they did appear in some of the earlier Fudoki, the local legend collections, it's in the 12th century that they became particularly widespread. That's when the kanji for their name became established, and when images of them first started to appear. They were generally associated with violence and chaos, and a particularly common legend of them in cities from the 12th century onwards was called the Yakiagyo, which translates literally as night procession of 100 Oni, in which a large group, while not necessarily 100, but 100 was the symbolic number at the time.
Yeah, as we said before, 100 is a very notable number for yokai, but it didn't always literally mean 100, did it?
No, it generally was just used for a very large number.
Yeah.
So this large number of yokai would parade through a city, just leaving destruction and chaos in their wake, and killing anybody caught outside, or even anybody who looked upon them. So the Onmyoji from the Bureau of Divination at the time would supposedly divine when the Hyakyagyo would pass through town, and they would warn the citizens to lock their doors and cover their windows.
It shows you just how dangerously this was taken as a threat as well. We're not talking, this isn't a theoretical mythology as well. This was treated as very serious business at the time.
Yeah, it really was. And it also was so commonplace that it would then show up in a lot of books. Pretty much any book in which Oni appeared, there would be a Hyakyagyo occurring. Particularly notable ones include The Great Mirror from 1100 and a collection of tales from Uji in 1220. And also from the 15th century onwards, they would appear in artworks called the Hyakyagyo Emaki.
Yeah. So these were like a type of scroll, weren't they?
Yes, it's an evolution of the picture scroll that was used to tell stories. And these particular ones, the Hyakyagyo Emaki, were one of the earlier sources that we know of which started to depict this event as being about more than just Oni. One particularly common one would be 100 or more of the animated objects instead of Oni. And I don't have the written form in front of me right now, so I didn't want to try and pronounce it again.
Give me 1 second. I can get it for you.
The Tsukumogami.
Yeah, Tsukumogami. I got it here.
Yeah, I'm learning Japanese. I should be able to do this.
Don't worry, we can cut around that. We can just cut to you saying the actual word.
Yeah. Or leave it in.
Yeah.
If people might.
Yeah, some behind-the-scenes contents for you people.
Being honest about how bad we are.
Yeah. Seriously, guys, we heavily edit these.
So, at this time, as well as being associated with violence, Oni were also associated with plague and epidemics and misfortune. In fact, some interpret that the original word did actually signify an epidemic, and it was later that the physical form then made it portrayed as an Oni. It's also suggested that they came to represent anyone considered to be an outsider. For example, smiths and metalworkers who would often live on the outskirts of town rather than live within the town itself. And also likening them to Yamabushi, who are a group of mountain ascetics who practiced Shugendo Buddhism, which is an amalgamation of Shinto mountain worship and Buddhism, which still survives to this day. There are still Yamabushi temples throughout Japan, and people becoming these monks even today. And these kinds of Oni, who became associated with the more marginalized cultures and people, were also sometimes thought to have more benevolent abilities. For example, there are a few stories of Oni aiding with safe childbirth. At the same time, this was also when the Tengu started to become more common and started to get a defined form. Much like the Oni, they'd been briefly mentioned in books such as the Nihon Shoki, and they had showed up in local folklore, and again gained their defined form in the Kamakura period. The name itself means either heavenly hound or heavenly sentinel. However, at the time, they tended to be an anthropomorphized bird of prey, often a kite, and were sometimes seen as kidnappers, sometimes seen as tricksters, and sometimes seen as harbingers of revenge. They were less overtly violent than the Oni, though much more often they were associated with disappearances rather than with outright violence. And they also became quite strongly associated with the Yamabushi, and they were also associated with evil or with non-Buddhist magics. So these are again Oni that start off as evil, but they start to get associated with more marginalized people, and some positive aspects are then attributed to them, such as teaching healing or teaching martial arts. The rise of these two particular yokai, like I mentioned earlier, is quite likely to be a reflection of the much more violent times that Japan was experiencing then. The Kamakura and the Muromachi periods, which together go from the end of the 10th century through to the end of the 16th century, were defined by the rise of the samurai class, which didn't exist prior to this point, the imperial government becoming less effective as regent clans start to take more power, which led to the formation of the shogunate, and also then the local warlords known as daimyo struggling for power, which eventually became the all-out war that was known as the Warring States, or Sengoku period.
Sengoku Jidai.
That's correct.
Or Jidai.
Sengoku is definitely correct. Not sure about the second one myself.
Yeah, it's spelled Jidai.
Jidai, yeah.
Jidai.
So yes, these were quite dangerous times, particularly for peasant class, which is probably why a lot of the folklore centered around people disappearing, people being killed in mysterious circumstances, or just large numbers of violent demons.
Mm.
And at the same time, the more positive ideas of Oni and Tengu may be related to the communities that, instead of submitting to a warlord, banded together and became more self-sufficient. Communities such as Iga and Mie provinces, which I'll go into a bit later when we get to the specific yokai.
Yeah.
So, at this stage, over the centuries, we've seen yokai begin as servants of the underworld. We've seen them as enemies of the gods. We've seen monsters to be slain. We've seen them as more ambiguous parts of everyday life, both relating to the natural world around people and the very objects in people's homes. We've seen them as tricksters. We've seen them as companions, helpful spirits, harmful spirits, before taking on this more violent role as the Warring States period continued, and representing fears of violence and plague and outsiders. And so now I'm going to hand over to you, Charles, so that we can move on to the Edo period, which was one of the biggest social and political upheavals that Japan had seen by that point. And so we see a whole new evolution of yokai.
Yeah, it's very interesting that kind of because we split the research between us for this episode. I was very interested to see the slow development of the kind of the darker and more violent side associated with the yokai. It doesn't surprise me, as you say, that it was associated with major changes in society, new social classes emerging, etc. What characterizes the Edo period going forward is a very, very different interpretation of how the yokai were looked at. And I think some of that does lie in what you were saying, Crofty, about the difference between being in a kind of volatile time socially, politically, where you had the extended period of civil war throughout kind of I think it was through the 15th and 16th century, wasn't it? The Warring States.
Yeah, that's correct. It was between 1600 and 1610 when that finally ended.
Yeah. So the Edo period, it's a little difficult to date exactly when it began. So what basically happened towards the end of the Warring States period was a number of kind of major players in Japan's politics, like the regional politics of the daimyo, slowly managed to reunify Japan. So obviously the main candidate you go to for that is that everyone is kind of more focused on in Japanese culture is Nobunaga Oda. But Nobunaga actually was killed long before the actual unification of Japan. So the actual initial reunification of Japan came underneath a man by the name of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who effectively tried to go, very much as you mentioned before, Crofty, for the imperial regent sort of role. The Kampaku is what it's referred to, so like a chief advisor role where he was really the power behind the throne for the emperor. So during that period, Japan was generally reunified, but the Toyotomi clan did not manage to persist in power. So after Toyotomi's death, and I think after his son served in a similar role, what actually happened was another family managed to seize power in Japan, and this was the Tokugawa clan. So the first of these is Tokugawa Ieyasu, I think. I do struggle to pronounce that one.
Yeah, Ieyasu.
And he took power as shogun from 1603. The beginning of this period and the reunification of Japan, it brought to the country a strong centralized government once again in the form of the shogunate. Again, the emperor remained, as he had throughout much of Japanese history, merely a symbolic figurehead with more religious duties associated. The Tokugawa shogunate was far more stable than its precursor administration. It lasted until the late 19th century, and it very much led to a period of peace, as you described when talking about previous periods of Japanese history. So during that time, the population of Japan grew, and with it, major cities such as you mentioned, Edo, and Osaka really started to become major sites of cultural exchange from all over Japan. So up until this, up until this period and throughout much of the Edo period, there was very much a regionalization of Japan. So even though there was a centralized shogun, most of Japan was kind of split up into individual daimyo realms. And the result was that there was less of a kind of, if you lived in one of these particular realms, there was perhaps less of a feeling that you were actually part of a unified country. You were more, in your own area, and then the lord next door was effectively, the foreign rival for the people of that area.
Well, the violence had ended and everyone paid tribute to the shogun. The states were essentially quite independent under their daimyo.
Yeah, it was still a feudal structure, I think is what we're grasping to say.
A feudal structure just without the violent side of it anymore, which I think a lot of the peasant class has quite appreciated.
Yeah. But the growth of kind of urban centres throughout this period of peace, to some extent, kind of sidestepped this regionalisation under individual lords. And that's for the simple reason that they kind of acted as these these major marketplaces of cultural exchanges. So you saw the rise of things like new forms of drama and theatre, like the kabuki drama. Ningo Jururi puppet theatre also appears during this period. I probably butchered those words.
Kabuki you got right.
Yeah.
I've never been sure on the puppet theatre either.
No. So, and then in addition to that, there was also the appearance of kind of this major new industry of artistic woodblock prints known as ukiyo-e.
Ukiyo-e.
Yoe, yeah. So in addition to these woodblock prints, there also was the appearance for the first time of a major publishing industry within Japan. So obviously we had the example given before Crofty of the Hyakuyago Emaki scrolls. We started to see more of what we would consider a more conventional form of book publishing appear during this time. And it's not surprising that yokai were featured very heavily in these early publications. But this process effectively served to do a couple of things to yokai. It both took all the regional variants of yokai and pushed them towards more standard forms, which is kind of anathema if you think about it. It's the early idea of a yokai that they are difficult to define.
Yeah, like we said, it maybe takes some of the mystery out of them, while also then making it much easier for us now to research them, I guess.
Yeah. And it made a much wider audience aware of these entities and to some extent sidestepped, again, as I said before, the regionalism that had built up around them, where individual yokai may have very different interpretations, almost from one province from another. So one of the major ways that yokai really proliferated in the initial parts of the Edo period was from an activity called the Hyaku Monogatari, known as the 100 Stories. This is probably going to sound quite familiar to anyone who has been involved in like seances or anything like that from a Western perspective, and there is a similar idea going on. So this practice consisted of large groups of people that would gather in a single room or a public venue where they would deliberately share stories of the mysterious. And many of these stories would heavily feature yokai. How these sessions would begin is that the participants would light a large number of either lanterns or candles, and for each story that was told, another candle would be extinguished. Finally, when every single candle was out, it is at that moment that it's said that a bakemono, so another term for yokai, would appear. And this practice really stands at odds with what you've said about yokai in previous periods, because this is one of the first times that we're seeing the yokai used as a source of mass entertainment.
Yeah, I'm sort of picturing people now saying Bloody Mary 3 times in front of a mirror.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same sort of tension and build up and release. And it's just interesting to see that quite quickly we're seeing this evolution going on with the yokai. They're already beginning to lose some of the sinister edge to them.
Yeah.
Obviously, the name of 100 Stories doesn't necessarily mean that there were 100 stories told. As we said before, it was simply used to mean a large number of stories. What's also important about these stories, however, was even if you weren't a participant in these gatherings, these stories began to be collected and published. And once again, this boosted this activity to a much bigger audience than those who were just lucky enough to be involved at the actual events. And that's actually one of the ways that we know there probably were less than 100 stories, is the fact that many of the published collections don't have 100 stories in them. In addition to this, we also have the element of the Hyakuyago Emaki scrolls appearing throughout the period. But where you mentioned before, Crofty, some of these scrolls starting to show inanimate objects being depicted as well, the Tsukumogami. In the Edo period, we really don't see the inanimate objects appearing anywhere near as much. So examples of this include the Bakemono Tsukushi and the Hyakai Zukan. What the interpretation of these scrolls by various experts on the topic is that they think that the creators of this scroll, their interest had shifted from previous forms to documenting a much wider range of yokai and trying to include more of them in individual scrolls and depictions.
So in terms of like the scarier stereotype versions, wanting to get that fear from it being something from an entirely different part of Japan, a culture, separated by a few hundred miles and so unknown, rather than creating this fear of something that might be hiding in your kitchen.
Yeah,
sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. You can probably also tell from the way I'm kind of structuring my section in this Crofty as well, is from this point onwards, the emphasis is now becoming less on the individual wide range of different stories and more on more specific forms for these creatures. And there is a third strand going on alongside these other two around the same period in the Edo that really does serve to demystify them even further. This development kind of coincides with a wider change of thinking amongst government circles and intelligentsia throughout the time. So, in the Edo period, there was a particular strain of Neo-Confucian philosophy known as Shushigaku, which I think means the investigation of things, or the understanding of things, something along those lines.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And the point of this philosophy was that it really encouraged actually going out and investigating things and attempting to understand their structure and order. And in some ways, this is kind of interpreted as an early attempt to apply, more modern attempts at scientific reasoning. And that really kind of stands at odds with the idea of the yokai, doesn't it? Because what people are now going to be doing from this point onwards is collecting and classifying as many of these stories and types as they possibly can. So, in this period, we see the appearance of early compendiums of natural history. So, a good example of this is what's called the Wakan Sansa Izui, which is also known, I think, as the Three Realms, by a man by the name of Terajima Ryoan. And what's interesting about this is, obviously, it's an attempt at natural history, but we see many yokai starting to appear alongside known animals in these volumes, with no real distinction. So, you see things like Tengu, Kappa appearing, etc. And the simple reason for this is that many of these creatures at the time would not really be considered that mythical when compared to other creatures from much further distances away. The example I saw was, in this period, a rhinoceros would be equally as mythical as a Japanese mermaid.
Yeah, which makes sense, as the only word of rhinoceroses would have been from travellers a few hundred years ago via India, through China, Korea, and into Japan that way.
So that's kind of the third strand that also starts to appear. So people actually trying to start some initial categorization of yokai. These forms all effectively came together in the early 18th century. And the person we have to thank for that is a man by the name of Toriyama Sekien, who lived between 1712 and 1788. And he essentially formalized a lot of the modern forms of yokai that we see. And I'll get into that when we do individual discussions of the major types of yokai. So between 1776 and 1784, he produced a 4-volume set that listed and illustrated over 200 individual yokai. Each of these were kind of presented early on with just an appropriate label, maybe a brief commentary or description, but it took until kind of later on that he really started to try and give proper descriptions. In a lot of cases, he drew on existing sources, so some of the characters that he provides in these volumes are very much similar to the ones that we've seen in the picture scrolls that we've been talking about. Some of them clearly came from the Three Realms, others appear to have come from local folklore traditions that he collected, and even some Chinese traditions. And what he did throughout much of his categorization work is he combined many of the regional yokai together, tried to combine their different names and made them into a larger, more generic yokai. So the example I have here is for the Kappa. The Kappa in certain areas of Japan, that was its name, but in other areas of Japan, its name was the Kawataro. And he presents both names here, for example. So you can see he's starting to conflate figures together that when we get into our deeper conversation weren't actually that similar, but we'll get into that. So in doing so, he kind of made this standardized form for many yokai, and he kind of gave a lot of them a concrete form and definition for the first time. So as we've seen before, many yokai were famous for shapeshifting and changing and just carrying this element of the indefinability. It's really with his work and the huge influence it has going forward that they, again, lose a substantial chunk of their mystery. And what he also kind of does is he pulls many of these yokai out of their individual stories that they might be known from for an individual region, and he starts to turn them into characters. And in addition to this, he also did something slightly interesting. He made up a whole bunch of yokai. So it's thought that as many as 80 of the yokai which he depicted either were developed from other regional traditions and turned into more fleshed out yokai, or were completely created by him. So yeah, it's hard to underestimate just how influential he was going forward. And even today, and we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about the modern period, his works remain influential in how people choose to depict yokai. He also had a major legacy in that he kind of influenced a very large number of the writers and artists who continue to depict yokai all the way until the end of the Edo period. So, yeah, he had a very outsized impact. What's also significant is he made his works not in the kind of picture scroll tradition that we'd seen before, but they were actually published in bound books as well, which could be very easily printed. So that may be one reason why it was so successful. Over the course of the remaining century of the Edo period, we see the yokai increasingly go from these dark figures not to really be crossed, kind of shrouded in mystery, to being a large element of popular culture. So they start to, thanks to these efforts, become more stock characters and appear in a diverse range of media. So the examples I found were, board games, shooting galleries, spectacle shows, and one which I thought was quite cool, they started to appear in a popular card game known as the Yokai Karuta. So Crofty, what modern card game do you think, where you have lots of little creatures with diverse forms, what do you think that this resembled?
Is it Pokemon, where you've got to catch them all?
Yes, indeed it was. I didn't read too much more into that, but that was the comparison given of how they were used. So I think that's quite self-explanatory.
Yeah.
They were also used in very light-hearted fashions, actually. So they were kind of used in a set of picture books from the period known as the Kibyoshi. Now these were kind of more irreverent themes used to kind of criticize contemporary society, which led to them actually being repressed by the government around the beginning of the 19th century. But in these materials, yokai increasingly appeared as kind of more goofy and more comical compared to the scary depictions that we've seen in earlier materials. And the last kind of thing I want to really say about the Edo period was the yokai became so pervasive throughout the national consciousness that in 1860, one of the last shoguns, Tokugawa Ieyasu, issued a proclamation when he went to visit the tomb of the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, Tokugawa Ieyasu. He issued a proclamation that any tengu or other demons should depart the area until his visit had concluded. The interpretation I saw of this proclamation wasn't that necessarily there was a fear that yokai would intervene with his visit, but more that this was a symbolic act of the shogun showing that not only did he have power over other people in Japan, but he had power over these entities as well. And it also, in many ways, kind of demonstrates how widespread that yokai had become within popular culture, because the shogun himself is now feeling that he actually has to demonstrate that he also has power over them. if that's the basic outline of how the yokai changed over the Edo period, they generally became much more formalized, much more light-hearted, and they lost a lot of the dangerous elements that you outlined earlier, Crofty.
Yeah.
So the end of the Edo period was probably one of the largest changes that Japan has ever seen. Very much coincided with a large-scale rewriting of many aspects of Japanese society. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate fell from power. And for the first time in many centuries, power was formally returned to the emperor by the final shogun. Around the same time, the capital was moved from Kyoto to Edo. Edo was renamed Tokyo. This coincided with the elite samurai class being abolished, and power in Japan largely moved from the hands of the regional lords and the elites of the Bakufu shogunate government, not to the emperor, but to a group of Western-influenced oligarchs that surrounded the emperor. The emperor was a very young man at the time, and this event saw a vast remodeling of Japanese society. So I have a good number of examples written down here. In this time, the army and the navy were restructured on a Western model. The education system was completely reformed, and the Shinto religious system, which up until this point I get the impression had existed very much as various decentralized shrine traditions, was largely and quite forcefully standardized. In addition to this, there was also a movement to kind of harmonize spoken and written Japanese. So I think this is called the, I'm going to get this one horribly wrong, Genbunichi movement.
Jinbunichi?
Jinbunichi. Something along those lines. This was a vast change in the way that Japanese society had worked. And with this modernizing government in place, the emphasis of many intellectuals and the kind of elites of the era moved away from indulging the yokai as part of popular culture to more of a hindrance of their efforts to modernize. So a great example of this, a kind of official discouragement of yokai, was in the way that elementary school textbooks from the era would be printed. So the attitude appears very much to have been older Japanese people are already having ingrained many of these local traditions and stories associated with yokai. Let's focus on the young children and from an early age reinforce these don't exist. So many of these textbooks include statements from the education ministry towards teachers. The government would like to see them teach their students that there is no such thing as Tengu. Despite this official discouragement, yokai would be used in other ways throughout this period, and I'll get back into that in a minute. But for the moment, one thing to mention that kind of in a continuation of the 100 stories that we saw in the previous era, there was another popular trend that, despite this official disencouragement, still emerged early on in the Meiji period. This is known as the Kokuri. So this was a divination game that was heavily influenced by a Western type of seance called table turning. In this game, participants would attempt to summon a spirit, and how they would do that is they would use a very simple apparatus that almost anyone in Japan at the time could have had access to. And what you would do is you take 3 bamboo rods and just tie them together in a simple tripod, and then on top of them you would place a rice container or a round tray or some sort of round container. And then with this lid balanced on top of the tripod, a number of people would kneel around the apparatus and place their hands on the lid. So to start, one participant would then read out a 10-minute long incantation, after which they would request, in order to see if a spirit or a yokai was present, that the spirit tilt the apparatus by lifting up one leg of the tripod. That's probably sounding quite similar to another practice to you, Crofty, isn't it?
Yeah. Things like Ouija boards for seances. So
Yeah.
Move the counter thing to show us your message.
Yeah. If the summoning was successful and one leg of the tripod was successfully lifted, the group would go on to ask the spirit questions. What I couldn't find out was how this question asking was conducted. So I am seeing something in my head very similar, as you say, to the Ouija board situation. But I don't have any details on how it actually was performed. But that was the ultimate goal of the ceremony. In addition to this, there also was a continuation of the encyclopedia approach that we mentioned beforehand that was very much codified in the work of Toriyama. During this period, there was, however, a different focus of this approach. So rather than trying to categorize and bring attention of these different yokai to a wider audience, the emphasis here was far more in trying to demystify the yokai, trying to find a natural explanation for why many of them existed, and being able to write them off as a result. So the most notable practitioner of this methodology was a Buddhist monk by the name of Inoue Eniro. So he travelled throughout much of Japan throughout his life. He was a prolific lecturer and writer on the subject. The example I saw was the first work he produced on this subject was 2,000 pages alone, which is hefty, shall we say.
It's impressive.
It is. In doing so, he effectively created a new area of study known as Yokai Gaku, or Yokai-ology, or even monsterology, I saw it described as well. And on the face of it, it's easy to interpret this movement as trying to just explain away the various phenomena associated with yokai and give a rationalization or a scientific explanation. It's a little more subtle than that in terms of what he personally was attempting to do. So this categorization was not based on explaining away all yokai. It was based on sifting out what he called the kakai, or false mystery, and the shinkai, or true mystery. What he was effectively doing here was attempting to narrow down which yokai were actually inexplicable, and not just an easily explained phenomena. The general result of these various movements was kind of to remove away the element of power that the yokai up until the Edo and the Meiji had, was to just take away that element of power, and many of the stories during this period moved more to people having power over yokai, and their appeal really was kind of reduced just to the element of the unknown associated with them in certain stories. There is, however, a strange contradiction in how the yokai were used in some ways, and this kind of goes forward past the Meiji period into the reigns of his son and grandson, which I think are the Taisho and, is it Showa periods?
Yeah, Taisho and Showa.
And in contradiction to the kind of attitude of, oh, let's de-emphasize these creatures and demonstrate to the populace that they don't exist, the yokai were used in a lot of kind of propagandistic ways during both the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And the focus of their use was to try and instill a sense of nationalism in the Japanese population. So up until the Meiji period, again, Japan's feudal structure meant that many people in diverse parts of Japan probably would not have had a great understanding that they were part of a wider country, and that the people just across the valley who were seen as your foreign neighbours are in fact part of the same country and their fellow citizens. And as part of attempting to kind of instill a sense of nationalism, the Japanese government started to exert its control over regions of Japan that historically had either had their own ethnic groups or that had not been directly controlled by the Japanese government. So the examples that people usually give of this are the Ryukyu Islands, which are a string of islands to the south of Japan that, again, have their own people, they have their own language, and they almost kind of have their own climate. So it's like ranges from subtropical in the north all the way to equatorial tropics in the southern parts of the region. And then the other example is the northernmost island of Japan. So Crofty, just remind me off the top of my head which one that is.
Hokkaido.
And up until kind of the Meiji period, this area was quite kind of sparsely occupied compared with the rest of Japan. And it kind of had its own culture and its own peoples and was ruled over by its own clan. And it was really the Meiji's kind of concern about Russian expansionism further north that led them to expand their control in those regions. And I think it was the case for the Ryukyu Islands. It was more of a concern of China's influence.
Yeah, because the Ryukyus do actually run all the way to Taiwan.
Yeah. So the Ryukyu Islands were annexed by Japan in the late 1870s, and as part of this annexation process, certain stories featuring yokai were used within educational literature to instill not only an approving attitude towards these actions in the Japanese public, but again to advance a more nationalistic agenda. So the example which I saw that was most prominently used was the Momotaro, or the Peach Boy story. So I won't go into this extensively, but the Peach Boy story concerns the contention of a boy by the name of Momotaro with a group of Oni who control a set of islands and who are undefeated in battles and conflicts with the Japanese populace. And over the course of his adventures, Momotaro successfully subdues and conquers these people. And in aid of the annexation of the Ryukyu Islands, they were very much equated with these Oni. And it was used very much as a device to justify the annexation. I don't really want to go too much into this as well, but a similar role for these stories, and there's a 12th century story also called the Hogan Monogatari. They were also used to some extent during World War II in order to kind of reframe and other the allies that Japan was facing during that time. So moving on to kind of the second half of the 20th century, we're very much getting into the modern era of the yokai and how they were imagined within popular culture. In many ways, the resurgence of the yokai after World War II was very much an attempt to harken back to a kind of pre-war, more innocent time in Japan. It was kind of a nostalgic throwback, is what I'm trying to say. And this period is also notable for an evolution in the way that yokai were thought about in society. So I gave the example beforehand of like how they were slowly collated in the encyclopedic kind of tradition throughout the Edo and Meiji periods, particularly from the efforts of Toriyama. The thing is, though, throughout many of these prior movements, the yokai, whilst they were categorized and written down, and there was some generalization of more regional varieties into one overarching archetype, there wasn't so much in the way of previously established yokai being adapted and changed. And this is very much the case in the early 20th century through to the later 20th century. You start to see yokai being reinterpreted to fit the ends and goals of society. So, Crofty, I think it would be fairly safe to say that if I were to try and break down all the various ways and media in which the yokai have appeared since, the 1960s onwards, that way lies the path to madness.
It really does, yes.
Yeah. At least from the 1980s onwards, the yokai there has been a veritable boom in their representation within Japanese popular culture, to the point where, again, it would be a fool's errand to try and detail every single one. What I'm going to talk about just very briefly, however, is one particular format in which the yokai were brought back to public attention that's proven to be incredibly influential. So these are the works of Mizuki Shigeru, who from the 1950s created a manga series. So for those of you who aren't aware of manga, Crofty, how would you describe manga?
Japanese comic books.
Yeah. There was one particular series by this author that really brought the yokai into the wider public consciousness. And this was the manga series with a name that I struggled every time I rehearsed this to try and say. The Jijiji no Kitaro, or the Spooky Kitaro. This series generally consists of like a wide range of adventures undertaken by a boy by the name of Kitaru. I think, I might be conflating this with another source, I think is 1/4 yokai. which allows him to interact with the wider world of the yokai. And again, it was a long-running and long-spanning series, and consisted of a wide range of adventures undertaken by this boy. And these adventures very much are based on his interaction with a large cohort of yokai friends that he has, and battles and contentions with both bad yokai and good yokai. So this series has then gone on to be a mainstay of anime to this day. I think it's had something like 7 series. It's had live action films. It's had all sorts of adaptations. And this is often credited by most sources on the yokai as where the kind of the groundwork for them re-entering popular culture came from. In modern Japan, yokai are now commonly found across many different forms of Japanese media, so manga, anime, literature, films, video games. I'm not going to go into trying to categorize all of those, but I did have another cool example I saw of this was, if anyone out there knows of a video game series by the name of Dark Souls, which has taken off in the West in the last 5-10 years or so. That company also made an earlier series called Otogi, in which the yokai were a major element. And I think in the first game in that series, one of the main villains is a man who was turned into a demon after his death, named Michizane. So, Crofty, who do you think that's based on?
I've just gone completely blank.
Sugawara no Michizane. I might have a different name written down here for what you called it, Crofty. So this was one of the early examples of someone turning into a yokai in your explanation, as far as I'm aware.
No, it is the same name that I had earlier. I've just kind of forgotten.
Fair enough. It's late. It's like 10 o'clock at night here, guys. Cut him some slack.
It's like 10 o'clock at night, and Charles was using his storytelling voice and caught me off guard.
I snuck up with you and hit you over the head with a story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, Sugawara no Michizane, the scholar and poet from the 9th century.
Yeah.
That guy.
So it's showing you these very early traditions of yokai are still, they're filtering through the cracks here in some ways. In addition to kind of this more wide pop cultural acceptance of yokai, there's also another phenomena appeared, at least since the 1970s, Crofty, called urban yokai. And the appearance of these are not surprising. So Japan, especially in the second half of the 20th century, has undergone very rapid and major urbanization. And it's not surprising then that, as with all elements and periods of Japanese history, new yokai would appear to take advantage of this new environment. So the best known example I could find of this is a yokai called the Kuchisake Ono, which kind of circulated wildly throughout Japan in late 1978 through the first half of 1979. So, Crofty, pick me up if I get anything wrong here. To the best of my knowledge, the Kuchisake Ona is an entity which takes the form of a beautiful young woman, aged between about 20 and 30 years of age, who wears a white mask over her mouth. So that's not an uncommon thing to have seen in Japan in more modern society, especially in more recent times. But before the world collapsed, it was generally used by anyone who had a cold to try and avoid infecting other people. So this figure would stand with her mask on a street, often around dusk time, and would approach young children. Upon addressing them, she would ask the children, "Am I pretty?" And if the child responded with yes, she would remove her mask to reveal that her mouth is slit all the way up to her ears. And then at that point, she would ask you again. If you said that she wasn't pretty, then she would come chasing after you. So this kind of, when I read this, Crotty, I got the vibes of a lot of kind of more modern ghost stories that appear in Japanese films and media.
Yeah, and also some of the manga, like I think she was quite an inspiration for Junji Ito, one of the more famous horror manga.
Yeah, that nut job, yeah.
Yeah. That really talented job.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, talented, but weird, yeah. Now, this legend is kind of interesting because people have kind of made an attempt to link it back to earlier Edo-era examples. So a good example of this is an entity known as the Kamikuri, or the hair cutter, which, as described, is a yokai that was known for cutting people's hair, I believe whilst they slept, from what I read, although I might be misremembering that. And there's also a bit of comparison being made to the Yamamba, which we are probably going to talk about in a minute. Let's put it that way. So, Crofty, that's kind of everything I have in the kind of general history of yokai, kind of from the Edo period onwards, more away to modern times. We will probably have some more specific examples in this next section that we can go into, and that we will kind of continue the story with.
Yeah.
But for the moment, what we thought we'd do, because trying to categorize all the different times of yokai is something of a fool's errand, let's talk about the major categories that we have come across in the process of our research, and maybe a few fun examples to throw in as well. So, Crofty, do you want to begin with one of your examples of what I referred to as the Big Five?
Yes. I think I'll start with one that has been very popular throughout anime and manga in recent years. Actually, it was one of the earlier ones to appear, the Kitsune. So, like I said, they're one of the most well-known today. The name itself is simply the Japanese word for a fox. However, as a yokai, this refers to a fox with the ability to shapeshift into human form, and sometimes with the ability to possess people. They're thought to have originated in China, where they're known as huli, and they're also common in Korea, where they're known as gumiho. In some cases, they're indistinguishable from regular foxes. In some cases, they were described as having multiple tails, and in some cases, they possessed fire-based abilities. In Japan, they hold a bit of a special place in Shinto that you don't see in Chinese or Korean versions of them, as they are messengers and attendants to the fox goddess Inari, who is the goddess of rice, harvest, fishing, and fertility. And you can see kitsune statues guarding the shrines to Inari, with over 40,000 being found throughout Japan today. In their earliest incarnations, they were thought to disguise as humans in order to take a lover or a husband, in some cases genuinely falling in love with them, whereas in some cases luring men away from their wives. One of the earliest stories of that, and probably the archetypal story from the time, was called Come and Sleep. It's set in Mino province, which is now Gifu prefecture, in the mountains in central Japan, in the 6th century. In it, a man set out to find himself a wife, and he met a woman described as a pretty and responsive girl who was looking for a good husband. And he asked her to marry him. They married and had a son together. The couple also owned a dog, which around the same time gave birth to a puppy. The puppy was always very aggressive towards the wife, until one day, when the wife was returning from bringing food to the women who were working in the fields, the puppy chased her and tried to bite her. In her fright, the woman transformed into a fox and fled atop a hedge where the puppy couldn't catch her. After people found out about this, the couple were forced to separate because being married to a kitsune was frowned upon. However, the man still loved her, and he asked her that every night she would return to his home after dark and spend the night together. And then every morning when she left, he would sing of his love to her. He named their son Kitsune no Atae, who grew up to be known for his great strength and his athleticism, and was supposedly the ancestor of the Kitsune family in Mino. And it was said that the name Kitsune comes from the old Japanese words for come and sleep, kitsu and ne. Although that's disputed as a historical thing, because now the two words would be ki and ne. But that's just me being pedantic about a language I don't speak very well.
Spoken like a true Englishman.
Yeah, I don't speak English very well.
Yeah. I speak Yorkshire, that's about it.
Aye, bat rate. There are other stories where it's more a case of the kitsune woman luring the man away. For example, the story of a man called Yoshifuji, whose wife is away visiting the capital when he meets a pretty young girl walking at night. Upon looking at her, he immediately forgot about his wife and children, and he chased after her. She refused to tell him her name, but she invited him back to her house. He declared his eternal love for her, and they settled down, and he stayed with her for 13 years, and they had children. In the meantime, his wife returned home, and his family were searching for him. The priests were praying for him and carrying out rituals in order to ask the gods to bring him home. After 13 years in his new home, a man shows up brandishing a stick and scares Yoshifuji's new family away and forces him out of his home. At the same time, his family see Yoshifuji covered in dirt crawling out from underneath the storehouse. He tries to explain to them that he's lived with this new family for 13 years, and a servant investigates and only finds a family of foxes underneath the storehouse, and it's revealed that in reality only 13 days have passed, and that he'd been tricked by a kitsune. So a monk performs an exorcism on him, and he returns to his old self, just horribly embarrassed, and lives on in good health until he's 61. So he wasn't harmed by any of this in the long run, just very confused. There is at least one modern story of a kitsune wife, I think from the 1910s, 1920s, I could be wrong. It tells of a farmer in Ishikawa Prefecture who returned home to find that there were now two of his wife. He understood that one was a shapeshifter, and so he questioned them both in order to determine who was his real wife, but they both answered his question perfectly. But one of them was just described as seeming wrong to him, and he sent her away. The wife who stayed bore him 2 children, and the family prospered until one day the children noticed that their mother had a fox tail. So having been found out, she again had to leave, much like the kitsune in the first story. However, each season she would return in fox form, and she would cast a spell on the rice fields. After this, the rice stalks would always appear empty to the tax collectors, and so the family would pay no taxes. But when they harvested the rice stalks, they would then be covered in rice, and the family would grow wealthy from that. And there were quite a few similar beliefs throughout history that a kitsune wife or a bound kitsune spirit were behind the wealth of some families. And even as late as the 1950s, there was prejudice against some families who were thought to have an ancestor kitsune. They were also thought to possess humans, sometimes in relatively harmless ways. For example, one kitsune who possessed a human in order to beg for food to feed their family. On the other hand, there were stories of the spirits of dead foxes who would possess humans who'd killed them in order to get revenge. And the final belief associated with kitsune is that they were able to create small fires, known as kitsune-bi or foxfire, which is, I guess, similar to what we might call a will-o'-the-wisp.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they were also associated with weather when it was both sunny and raining at the same time, and with rainbows.
Yeah, strange occurrences, yeah.
Yeah. And they also lend their name to a popular dish, Hitsune Udon, which is udon noodles with a sheet of deep-fried tofu on the top, which kitsune were thought to enjoy.
Yeah, I think I'd enjoy it as well. So.
I think I would, yeah.
It's a shame that the only Japanese restaurant we know is closed.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
And so is Japan right now.
Yep.
So with that, I will leave off kitsune and hand over to you, Charles, as I believe you have another shapeshifter.
Yeah, this was a kind of a good turn of events. I do have what is often sometimes thought of as the counterpart to the kitsune, which is the tanuki. As with the kitsune, the tanuki is a slightly odd example of a yokai, and it is based off a real creature. So for those of you who are not aware, the tanuki is also referred to as the raccoon dog, and is a kind of species of small, nocturnal mammals that kind of fills a similar natural role to the raccoon in the New World. So generally it's omnivorous, it lives close to human settlements and tends to scavenge on the outskirts of human society and is quite happy to be eating human foods. It's kind of thought that in terms of its role as a yokai, this ecological niche that it occupies has kind of influenced its depiction. So it kind of skirts the line between being an overworld entity that we can see and perceive and being a member of the underworld. And part of that is shown in its role as a shapeshifter. So where the kitsune are depicted often in their shapeshifting form as beautiful women, sometimes leading men astray, the Tanuki is often more visualized as the bumbling counterpart of a shapeshifter. Generally, they're portrayed to be quite like pot-bellied, kind of bumbling, big fans of sake and getting drunk, and they tend to often impersonate, of all things, when they're shapeshifting, Buddhist monks. They also have like a big element to them that is kind of difficult for us to discuss because we're supposed to be a clean tag podcast, or episode, or whatever we want to call this. So one of the major features of real-life Tanuki is they have massive scrotums. And as a result, they are considered fertility symbols. And through this route, they've kind of been co-opted not just as a fertility symbol, but as like a sign of prosperity and good fortune. So, as you mentioned before, there are examples of kitsune statues being displayed. You're likely to see a Tanuki statue being displayed, or even just an image of them, in places like restaurants and bars to give prosperity and good fortune to the establishment.
But hopefully not with the attribute you just described on show in a restaurant.
Oh,
the raccoon pouch, as Studio Ghibli called it.
It is displayed quite prominently in most imagery, so I'll have to maybe work safe this video afterwards.
Yeah, we'll dub you over with raccoon pouch, which was what they used in the English dub of Pompoko.
Yeah, which was going to be one of the examples I was going to give, where most people in the West probably know the Tanuki from, is the Studio Ghibli film Pompoko. Or to give the Japanese name, Heisei Tanuki Gassen Ponpoko, just to be fair. The first documented appearance of a Tanuki-like creature is probably actually referring to a slightly different yokai based on a slightly different creature, and I think you actually discussed it in detail, Crofty, so I won't go too much into it. But in the Nihon Shoki, there is what is referred to as a Mujina, which appears very similar to a Tanuki, but is probably based more on the Japanese badger. Moving beyond that, though, they begin to appear more often in, as you said, the spoken stories or the Setsua. And the example I have from that comes from a compilation known as Tales from Uji. So in this story, a mountain hermit who, after spending many, many years of deep devotion, begins to receive nightly visits from, and I'm going to really struggle with this word as well, I did actually boost up a guide to this, a bodhisattva. Basically anyone who has made a resolution to become a Buddha within wider Buddhism. And upon seeing this heavenly vision, riding on his white elephant, the mountain hermit decides one evening to show this vision to another person, and this is a hunter who brings him food. But when he invites the hunter to view this vision, the vision appears anyway, radiates this beautiful light, and this makes the hunter suspicious because he's a hunter. His job is to go out and kill animals. So why is he being permitted this big glimpse of the divine? He can, it's understandable with the hermit who is deeply devout, but in his case it seems a little stranger. So his response is to fit an arrow to his bow and shoot the image. The light immediately goes out. There's a big crashing sound, and in the morning, when the hermit and the hunter go and follow the trail of blood, they find, at the bottom of a ravine, a dead Tanuki with an arrow in its chest. This sort of end for the Tanuki was one you alluded to, didn't you?
Yeah, the idea of their tricks sort of backfiring quite a bit on them.
Yeah, a lot of the time they are seen in a slightly more clownish manner. So a lot of the time they will try to trick someone by shape-shifting. They will usually be accidentally revealed, usually because they fail to hide their tail. And then it almost always ends up with the Tanuki dead. This image of the Tanuki kind of continues during the Edo period. There are some slightly darker depictions that appear as well. So a good example of this is a folktale called the Kachi Kachiyama, Crackling Fire on the Mountain. And it tells the story of a Tanuki who cooks an old woman in soup, transforms themselves into the woman's shape, and serves the woman to her husband. So there is like a subset of these kind of more graphical tales. I'm not going to go too much into them, but they almost always end with the Tanuki experiencing a horrific set of tortures. Let's put it that way. It always backfires on the Tanuki.
Yeah, I read that tale in the Ozaki collection of fairy tales. I think in that case it was the badger rather than the Tanuki.
Was it? Yeah, I'm going from a summary here.
Yeah, so. That's it. I've read there's also variants where it is a Tanuki, so it's one of those cases where they were quite interchangeable.
Another major attribute associated with the Tanuki is, in addition to themselves being shapeshifters, they at times would also have like abilities to create optical illusions. So Tanuki, in addition to this, they're kind of adept at producing sounds and sonic mirages that would lead people astray. A good example of this was a story that was actually reported in the To Nippo newspaper in 1889. And they're used effectively in this story to kind of like articulate the backlash that some of the modernizing enterprises within the country have received. And the example here is the train. So here is the report or the legend from May 3rd, 1889. Just before arriving at Okigawa, one evening a steam train that had left Ueno in Tokyo encountered another train with its steam whistle blowing, advancing along the tracks from the opposite direction. The train driver was surprised. He hastily reduced his speed and blew his whistle wildly. The oncoming train did the same, blowing its whistle insistently. However, the train that had appeared close at first did not seem to come any closer. When he fixed his eyes on it, the train seemed to be there, but it also seemed not to be there. It was very unclear, so he increased his speed so much that he was going to crash into the other train. But the other train just disappeared like smoke, leaving not a trace. However, where it had been, 2 old Tanuki the size of dogs were found lying dead on the tracks, having been hit by the train. Thinking they were terrible nuisances, and now where they would get their comeuppances, the drivers skinned them and used the meat for Tanuki soup. What a surprise that such a thing should occur these days during the Meiji period. So I think that's a good sum up of the various ways that the Tanuki has been interpreted. They generally are a yokai that, in most circumstances, is seen more as a clownish figure and only rarely kind of has more of the violence associated with many earlier yokai.
Yeah.
Okay, so Crofty, with that, I'm going to hand over to you to your next example.
Yes, where we move on to one of the more violent of the big 5 Oni now. So those who prefer their stories to have blood and guts and gore and violence, rather than a man who loves his wife and a trickster raccoon. This one's for you. So these are the Oni. As I said earlier, they were large, brutish and violent creatures. They were often depicted with red or yellow skin. They always had horned heads, though the number varied, and they generally had large teeth and claws. So they were very much our stereotypical depiction of devils and demons. They would wield iron clubs, as I said earlier, and wear the tiger skin loincloth that we mentioned. This image, which originated around the 12th century, is thought to be influenced by the Buddhist descriptions of hell. And in fact, the earliest images of these Oni appear in Buddhist scrolls known as the Jigyu Zoshi, or Hell Scrolls.
What a delightful name.
Yeah, I mean, it's very descriptive and self-explanatory. At
Yeah,
least.
I can picture it in my head. That is fair.
Yeah. You pick them off a shelf of scrolls, you know what you're getting into when you open it.
I'll just go to the Hell Scroll section.
Yeah, the priests won't frown upon that at all. As well as these Buddhist Hell Scroll images, they were also thought to be influenced by the Raijin, which are the name for the 8 thunder gods who were born from Izanami's corpse. And since the 12th century, this image hasn't really changed at all. It's this type of image that shows up when we see Oni in video games, such as the Onimusha series, which was where I'd first heard of them.
Yeah.
And throughout the Edo and the Meiji period as well, they did keep these same characteristics. They did become, for a while in the Heian and the Kamakura, a generic term for the yokai, which is why in the Yakiagyo processions, which one of the kanji, the ki, is the same as the Oni kanji, which is where the association comes from.
Yeah.
It's often more than just Oni in the later scrolls. And like I said earlier, they are also often depicted as being on the edges of society and being outcasts, which sometimes gave them a negative association and sometimes a more positive association. Most often in the stories, they are portrayed as antagonists, both in the oral folktales and in the big heroic narratives. One of the most famous of the heroic narrative styles is a story called the Shooting Doji, or the Sake Drinking Boy. This is a story of Minamoto no Yorimitsu, the famous yokai slayer I mentioned earlier, famous warrior. In Kyoto, in the 11th century, 10th century, there were quite a lot of young women getting abducted, it was said. The Emperor's diviners determined that the culprits of this were Oni, who lived on Mount Oe, quite close to Kyoto, and the Emperor ordered Yorimitsu and his retainers to hunt them down. Yorimitsu and his men disguised themselves as Yamabushi monks, and they prayed for guidance when they reached the mountains, and 3 messengers of the gods appeared before them in order to aid them. The messengers told them that the lead yokai, Shooting Doji, is quite fond of alcohol, and he gives them a barrel of magical sake that was supposedly poisonous to Oni. Upon finding Shooting Doji's iron palace deep within the mountain, they first bluff their way inside, and they are invited to eat and drink with Shooting Doji and his men. The alcohol knocks out all of the Oni, but in his unconscious state, Shooting Doji grows to twice his original size, and when they try and attack him, he wakes up. The other Oni are quite easily killed, but Yorimitsu and his retainers need to summon help from these messengers of the gods again in order to finally subdue Shooting Doji and cut its head off. And then, after its head's been cut off, they have to destroy the head entirely as it continues to fight on without a body. So, while in this story they are quite clearly evil, they've been kidnapping young women, and after they've been defeated, Yorimitsu finds dungeons filled with skeletons where the young women are being kept, fortunately still alive. And so the Oni are clearly evil. But there is the quite interesting part that they display hospitality to Yorimitsu and his men when they're disguised as Yamabushi.
Yeah, it's the ambiguous nature coming in there, isn't it?
Yeah, whether it's the ambiguous nature of the Oni and potentially a positive trait to them, or whether it's more a negative view of the Yamabushi as associating with Oni, I'm not sure. Or it might be that, depending on who was telling the story, that the emphasis was placed in a different way.
Yeah.
In the stuff I've read about it, it's not really made clear. It's just suggesting that there is more ambiguity to this than you would initially think. So from then on, and for most of their history, the Oni were viewed as marauders, bandits, or kidnappers. And in these kinds of heroic stories, the only way to deal with them is to attack their stronghold and kill their leader on his home turf, essentially. And this goes back to the story of Momotaro, that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It originated in the Muromachi period, so about 150 years or so before the Edo period, and was published in written form, like you said, during the Edo period, which was where the most common version comes from. In this story, Momotaro was born from a giant peach, which an old and childless couple found floating down a river. He explained, when he began to grow quite quickly from the peach, that he had been bestowed by the gods to be their son. And the name they gave to him, Momotaro, Momo means peach, and Taro means eldest son. When he matured into adolescence, he left his parents in order to go and fight a band of Oni who had been marauding over their land. And he sought them out on a distant island called Onigashima, or Demon Island. En route, he met and he befriended a talking dog, a monkey, and a pheasant, who all agreed to help him in his quest in exchange for a portion of his rations, which were millet dumplings known as kibi dango, which were thought to give him great strength. On the island, they broke into the demon's fort, and with the great strength gained from these millet dumplings, they beat the band of demons and they forced them to surrender. And they took the chief of the Oni as their captive and returned all the plundered treasure. In the Edo period, which in this part does hark back to what you mentioned about being used in sort of as a metaphor for other people, for people they were afraid of, it was thought that this island referred to the island of Megijima, which is in the inland sea between Honshu, the main island of Japan, and Shikoku, which is the small island just south of Honshu and east of Kyushu. And this region of the sea was thought to be where pirates operated at the time, and Megijima specifically had quite a large network of man-made caves that may have been inhabited by pirates. So it may be that this story started out as a way of demonizing the pirates, mythologizing adventures involving pirates, and then it went from that into being used for any other enemy from outside of Japan, as it were. And that's what led to what you said.
Yeah. Just a helpful thing, guys. Pirates are cool enough by their own. They don't need demons, okay?
Yeah. We all like pirates here.
Stop with the anti-pirate prejudice.
Justice for pirates. So one final thing on the Oni. More recently, so more modern times, they've generally been recast as characters to be used in festivals. In festivals such as the Small New Year on January the 15th, which is celebrated in North Japan. It features men dressed in Oni masks, travelling from house to house and accepting offerings of food and drink and pretending to chase children. In February, the Setsubun festival, which heralds the coming of spring, includes a custom in which people scatter soybeans around the house while shouting, "Out with Oni, in with good fortune," which is thought to have originated from a Buddhist purification ritual. And some shrines form a larger version called Suina, which involves volunteers dressed as Oni who dance and roar at the crowds before being driven off by the priests. So while the belief in them has faded, and while this image of them as marauders and violent warriors destroying your town has very much gone away, the image as a representation of bad luck still survives in terms of ritual and celebration.
Actually, one of the rare examples amongst the big five of a yokai that has kept some of its more negative connotations.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them have been kind of, as we will get onto in a minute, have been kawaii-fied.
Yes, from kawaii to kawaii. For anyone who knows that bit of Japanese. So I think that is it for Oni.
Yeah.
I could hand back to you for your next choice of yokai.
Yeah, so I have, I was quite glad we kind of randomly sorted these. There wasn't any plans to who was doing which. And I'm quite glad I got the Kappa, because the Kappa was one of the few examples on this list that I actually knew of from quite a while ago as well. Because when I was a young child, I had a Game Boy game. I think it was Game Boy Advance, it might have been. in a series called Harvest Moon that nowadays is probably more famous because Stardew Valley basically took over its style of game. And in that game, I can't remember which one it was, if you went up to the mountain lake and fished in the lake, you could accidentally catch a Kappa. So, the Kappa, or the Kawataro, is a creature that is often associated with rivers, lakes, other large sources of water, and it is also known for that reason as the River Child. As with most yokai, there is a number of regional variations that go around the general archetype of the Kappa. Most commonly in the past, it has been described either as resembling a monkey or like a hairy primate-like being, which is a description that largely seems to have come from more western regions of Japan, or as a giant frog or turtle, which is the Eastern Japan interpretation, and that's largely the dominant one nowadays, as a large figure that resembles some characteristics of a turtle. Probably the most distinguishing feature in its latest incarnations, and to be honest, even from kind of the Edo period onwards, is the presence of a bowl or dish-shaped impression in its forehead, which contains quite a quantity of water, and we'll get back to that in a second. In most versions of stories associated with the Kappa, it is described as childlike but disproportionately strong. So the way that a Kappa can often be fooled and its strength defeated, however, is that if it can be tricked into spilling the water that's held within the impression in its head, it will be robbed of its strength, and in many cases that leads to the creature's swift defeat. So in its more original forms, the Kappa is a far more sinister figure. The earlier versions of it is a much more mischievous and deadly creature who often would attempt to drag animals such as horses and cattle into water and drown them, and even young children. And this is where I get back to another part of our podcast where I'm questioning our clean tag designation again. The warning given to young children was that if this creature successfully pulled them into the water, it would usually attempt to reach into their anus, into their intestines, and extract the victim's liver for consumption. So, in ancient times, obviously the understanding of the human body and biology was much different, and it was thought that this practice would dislodge a ball known as the shirikodama, which is located near the anus, and in doing so would be fatal to the victim. The Kappa was also known to enjoy certain types of different food, so the most commonly mentioned are eggplant, melons, and cucumbers in particular. Part of the legend was that children again would be warned, don't go swimming after consuming these foods because you may be attacked by a Kappa. So to have a look at how the Kappa evolved over time, probably the earliest narrative associated with the Kappa again appears in the Nihon Shoki, which I think, Crofty, you went through in quite good detail.
Yeah.
Which was the snake-like water creature called the Mitsuchi, is it?
Yeah.
So this is a snake-like creature that's known for having killed travelers near a river. I think it's explicitly labeled from the year 379. And again, it has many of the characteristics you described before, where it produces a huge amount of poison and plagues travelers. The actual story account I have of it here is when the creature had been terrorizing the river for long enough, the district warden, who is described as a man of fierce temper and great bodily strength, stood on the pool of the river fork and flung into the water 3 whole calabashes, which are a type of gourd, I believe.
Yeah, I had to Google that as well when I looked that up.
Yeah. And in doing so, he said, "Thou art continually belching up poison, and therewithal plaguing travellers. I will kill thee, thou water snake. If thou canst sink these calabashes, then I will take myself away. But if thou canst not sink them, then I will cut up thy body." And in the end, obviously the creature fails to sink the gourds and is duly dispatched. The reason I reiterate this story from earlier, Crofty, is there is a later story known as the Kappa Mukuiri, where a Kappa is again defeated after it fails to sink gourds in a river. And in addition to this, obviously, there are other common ways to vanquish a Kappa which are associated with many kind of aquatic spirits. So the most obvious is usually just to expose them to iron. The Kappa really doesn't seem to have been much more than a regional creature. So it appeared in many diverse forms throughout many regions of Japan, but it doesn't appear in any major depictions that I'm aware of beyond the Nihon Shoki until really the Edo period, where it appears very commonly in illustrations. So the first appearance I found, where it appeared in the Three Realms that I mentioned before, where it is described with the following description. About the size of a 10-year-old child, the Kawataro, so that's the label used in this case, stands and walks naked and speaks with a human voice. Its hair is short and sparse. The top of its head is concave and can hold a scoop of water. Kawataro usually live in the water, but in the light of the late afternoon, many emerge into the area near the river and steal melons, eggplants, and things from the fields. By nature, the Kawataro likes sumo. When it sees a person, it will invite him to wrestle. If there is water on its head, Kawataro has several times the strength of a warrior. Kawataro has a tendency to pull cattle and horses into the water and suck blood out of their rumps. People crossing rivers must be very careful. Later on in Toriyama Seiken's works, it appears under both labels of Kappa and Kawataro, but this really is where the Eastern version of the figure, is more like an amphibious water spirit, becomes the standard going forward. The more monkey-like figure fades out of popular consciousness. In the northern part of Japan, there's additionally another series of stories to do with Kappa. So in that area, the Kappa was known for attempting to drown horses. But as frequently would happen, they would fail in this undertaking, and quite often they would actually lose their arm in this process. Now, if you were a Kappa, this was not a huge impediment, because Kappas were also thought to have special medical knowledge which would allow them to reattach their limbs as long as a certain amount of time had not passed. Often within these stories, what happens then is the Kappa goes to the owner of the horse and negotiates for the return of its arm. Sometimes, it's done in return for labour, like irrigating fields, or for advanced medical knowledge, something along those lines. Finally, there is a similar story that is told about a more unsavoury habit of the Kappa, which was linked to what we described before, of how it would attempt to extract the livers of its victims. And this is the practice of the Kappa concealing itself within toilets. So, I have a description here from, again, Michael Dillon Foster's book, The Book of Yokai, and it reads as follows. Long ago, the maid of a doctor's household went to the outhouse at night, and out of the toilet reached a hairy hand, perhaps a human, perhaps a monkey, she didn't know what, and made to stroke her buttocks. She was frightened and told her experience to the doctor. On hearing this, the doctor grabbed a sword and exclaimed, "I'll go conquer this thing," and entered the outhouse. Sure enough, when a hand reached out of the toilet, the doctor grabbed it and chopped it off with his sword. He brought the hand inside and put it on his examination room. The next evening, there was a knock at the front door. Assuming it was a patient, the doctor went out and discovered that it was the Enko whose arm he had chopped off the day before. "Doctor," the Enko said, "please return my arm. If I don't apply medicine and reattach it quickly, I won't be able to reattach it at all. I won't do anything bad anymore, so please return my arm." When the doctor at first refused, the Enko signed a pledge promising to teach him secret knowledge and how to make a medicine for mending bones. And so it seems the doctor then returned his arm. After this, it is said, the doctor prospered as a specialist in setting of bones. So, yeah, that's another aspect of the Kappa. I'm not sure whether I should bring this up, Crofty. It reminds me of an event in a video game called The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, where, if a certain time at night you go to the local hotel toilet, a hand emerges from the toilet. And in this case, it asks you for paper, so it may be a very different Japanese legend that I am less aware of, or it may be a wholly new thing to that particular piece of media.
It pops up in a few other Zelda games as well. It's quite a common one there.
It's strange that that is a common one of all things in that series, but anyway. So in the 20th century, the Kappa has really been quite sanitized as a figure. So many of those elements we described before are quite sinister. From the 1920s onwards, there has been much more of a shift towards a more comical appearance. This is mostly marked by the release of a short novel named Kappa in the late 1920s by a man by the name of Akutagawa Ryonosuke, where he used Kappa characters as analogues for humans in an attempt to kind of satirize more contemporary Japanese society. Since then, many artists and manga writers have basically slowly cutified or kawaiified the Kappa. So in more modern terms, it's usually used like as a mascot. It often appears to advertise things like sake, credit cards. The example that Michael Dillon Foster gives is that they were, in his time in Japan, used as a mascot of a major national sushi chain. And their appearance has generally been modified to match. They are much more humanoid and childlike, with only the kind of vestigial elements of the turtle shell and the bowl impression on their head. A lot of the time now it is just depicted as a bowl. Finally, they've also been used very much as an environmental symbol in the last few decades, a lot of the time associated with the protection of rivers. And here they're increasingly being used really just more as a sign of unspoiled nature. And in many ways, the more unsavory elements we detailed are very much now a thing of the past. So, Crofty, I believe that brings us to the last of the big five.
Yes. Another one that's sort of gone from a much more threatening presence in ancient times now to a much more benevolent presence. And this is the Tengu. Some people might know the name from the old Power Rangers TV show, where
yes.
one of the generic minions of the bad guys were Tengu, which looked like basically people in cheap crow costumes. Some might know the Tengu from games such as Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, where they are described as humanoid crows. Or some might know them from quite a lot of mountain Buddhist temples in Japan. For example, the temple Yakoin Yuji on Mount Takao, where they are now seen as sort of guardians of the temple. Initially, much like Oni, they started out as vaguely defined spirits that were associated with misfortune or with people going missing. And again, around about the same time as the Oni in the Kamakura period, images of them first started being depicted, and that's when they became much more commonplace. They at that time became described as being about child height, with bird faces, human arms and legs, and wings on their back about a yard long. And they were often said to kidnap humans, in particular children. And these specific type of Tengu became known as Karasu Tengu, or Crow Tengu, even though at the time they more often resembled birds of prey, the most common one being a kite. However, the name persisted, and that is what has led to the more modern perception associating them with crows. Some stories at the time would depict them as incarnations of dead warriors, or even one dead emperor, the 12th century Emperor Sutoko, who died in exile and was plotting his revenge in the form of a kite at the head of a group of Tengu. And so, in some ways, they did also, for a while, become associated as spirits of vengeance. So more often, they were depicted as fallen monks or fallen Yamabushi. And stories quite often described the Way of the Tengu. This was a path to learning forbidden magics by Buddhist monks who were too prideful to achieve enlightenment. They also described the realm of Tengu, which was an otherworld reserved for fallen monks who'd failed to overcome temptation. One Buddhist faction quite often would demonize another by comparing them to Tengu, and this description was particularly common as both a positive or a negative description when referring to Yamabushi monks. At the beginning of the Kamakura period, these Tengu, who were compared to Yamabushi, were also thought to teach secret martial arts abilities. In particular, in one story, they trained a famous general called Morimoto no Yoshitsune, who was quite instrumental in the transfer of power to a new regency at that time, when he was aiding his brother Morimoto no Yorimoto. That can't be right. Morimoto no Yorimoto.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to assume I've written that down right.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit wrong. So, these Tengu admitted to being fallen monks, but they also claimed that they wanted to aid Morimoto in his fight for justice, and so they taught him secret martial arts skills, which supposedly granted him supernatural speed and agility, and made him instrumental in winning the war. Some other stories have them teaching martial arts to peasants or to anyone sort of seen as an underdog, or who was at a disadvantage in a battle. And they were also thought to teach healing abilities to monks. And these abilities, even though they prevented a monk who had fallen to the way of Tengu from finding enlightenment, they were still, being healing abilities, obviously very beneficial for humans as a whole. So this was sort of where their more positive association started to begin. And there is a bit of a historical parallel with this version of the Tengu. The historian and writer John Mann, in one of his books, talks about how the Yamabushi ascetic monks, while they were quite often looked on with suspicion, due to their lifestyle, they were very physically fit, living in the mountains and having a lot of rituals involving travelling through quite rough terrain. They trained in martial arts, they trained in medicine in order to be self-sufficient out in the wild, and trained in a lot of wilderness survival techniques. And he and some other historians have suggested that these Yamabushi taught these various techniques to the people of Iga and Mie provinces during the Kamakura period, in order to allow the rural people of these provinces, these villages, to protect themselves from the warlords without needing to submit to being ruled by any of the warlords. Iga and Mie historically did remain independent from the warlords by using guerrilla-style tactics in order to defend their villages and their lands. And they are thought to have become the original ninja because of that. And so later on, while still keeping their independence, they then sold their skills as mercenaries during the Sengoku period. That's another case where the myth and the history are slightly intertwined, though I couldn't say which one came first.
Yeah.
In the Edo period, the Tengu underwent a bit of an evolution. They then became the long-nosed humanoid figures that are most commonly seen today, and that are depicted in statues at quite a lot of mountain temples. So this is where the benevolent aspects of them became the dominant description of them. They became known as guards and protectors of a lot of mountain temples, particularly, like I say, the temple on Mount Takao. One story from one of the villages around the base of Mount Takao, where now Hachioji City is, tells a woman who would always cook food for the Tengu, and when she fell ill, the Tengu then provided her with healing water from a spring on the mountain in order to bring her back to health. At this time, there were still scattered stories of Tengu committing kidnappings, which were referred to as kamikakushi, or spiriting away, which inspired the title of another Miyazaki film, even though it did not actually feature any Tengu.
Well, you could argue the protagonist was indeed spirited away.
Yeah, that's it. She was spirited away by quite a few different yokai, just none of them were explicitly Tengu. In some cases, in the Edo period stories, this was seen as a punishment for disobedience, whereas sometimes the victim merely travelled for a few days with the Tengu and saw interesting places, but they were always returned unharmed. And there's some stories where Tengu became like the Tanuki, sort of attempts at tricksters and pranksters that didn't really work. but the Tengu didn't really end up harmed in any way from these pranks. For example, there was one story where the Tengu asked a gambler what he was most afraid of, and the gambler told the Tengu he was most afraid of gold and mochi rice cakes, which the Tengu then decided to try and scare him with by making them rain down on him. And the gambler had a great day.
Yeah.
And so from then on, the trickster aspect slightly remains as part of their role as protectors of temples, but mainly just creating noises in the mountains that sound like laughter in order to startle travelers. Apart from that, they're now pretty much seen as the guardians of these temples and most well known for the statues that you'll see there. And I think that brings us to the end of the Big Five.
Indeed it does. Okay then, so Crofty, what I thought would be a good way to end off would for us to do just a quick kind of round off of various types of yokai that we encountered over the course of our research that we thought were particularly interesting and haven't really come up anywhere else.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things to me is yokai, we've discussed the more kind of elaborate ones. We discussed like the Big Five, as we said. A lot of yokai are very simple. So I'm going to give the example of the Azuki Arai, or the Bean Washer.
Ah, yes, I remember that one.
Yeah, so this is a yokai that all they're really known for. There is a bit of a backstory, but the main thing they are known for is creating the sound of beans being washed in water. One of the explanations I saw for this was it's mostly an explanation of the sound of certain sounds that are produced when water runs across like pebbles or foliage or anything like that, and it's really just the result of an actual natural phenomena.
Yeah, I think there are a few where nowadays we would recognize them as a natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
So if I may go on to one, if you don't have any more examples of that one.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead.
As another example of what we would now recognize as an explainable phenomenon, one that was called the Tenjo Name, or the ceiling licker, which was thought to reside in houses with quite high ceilings, and rather than licking the ceiling clean, it instead left black stains, which I think visited my flat a while ago, and I got rid of with some cleaning fluid by fixing my extractor fan and getting some of those little dehumidifier salt things.
Yeah.
So yes, this one is probably best explained by poor ventilation, high humidity leading to things like black mold, and tobacco smoke staining the ceiling.
Yeah. Okay, I am then going to throw in the Nin Menju, or Jin Menju, which is the human face tree. So this is a strange plant, which, as described, it's either a tree with human heads, it can be a tree with human-shaped flowers, and it also sometimes is called that because it bleeds when cut. This is a weird one. The image apparently comes from Mizuki Shigeru, who we noted. This is a much later yokai, done in like the 20th century, and it might come from an image taken from an earlier Chinese text that apparently depicts Alexander the Great through his role as having conquered through a significant portion of the Silk Road. A illustration of him conversing with a tree bearing human heads. So this comes from, I think it's called the Sankai Tuhi, and it's probably based off earlier Persian texts that were communicated along the Silk Road.
Wow, that's a impressive distance for a yokai to travel.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy, that one. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Especially when trees don't usually travel very fast.
Yeah. Well, maybe not around where you live.
Sorry, there's no mangroves around here.
No. Crofty, do you want to then round off with one particular yokai that we threatened to talk about earlier?
Ah, yes. Our old friend Yamauba, who we described a few episodes ago as being quite similar to the Russian witch, Baba Yaga. Yeah, she's thought to have originated as the Hags of Yomi, who I discussed earlier on. And since then, became known as an old woman who lives in the mountains and was sometimes thought of as cannibalistic and a kidnapper, but was also sometimes thought of as quite liking children and wanting to help take care of them. And so may also have simply been a woman who was exiled from the village for one reason or another. And so it's another one of those quite ambiguous figures where it seems to be if you treat her kindly, she'll treat you kindly. But if you treated her with fear, then she would get angry and violent with you.
Yeah, it's very, very similar to the Baba Yaga of Russian legend. So I think we said most of what we needed to say about this particular yokai in that episode. So feel free to go back and give that one a listen.
Yeah.
Okay, Crofty, I think that probably is going to round off our tour of the world of the yokai. It was an interesting one. I think I, going in, did not expect the variety and breadth of the history of these creatures, and I'm amazed that we kept this down to one episode in the end.
Yeah, I think it's quite impressive that we managed to do it. It's good that we had a sort of defined history.
Yes, it made it a lot easier to work with.
That's what helped, I think.
Okay, folks, so our next episode, which hopefully will come to you much quicker than this last one. Apologies, been busy with some stuff. What do we want to say, Crofty? I'm going to say we're going pure mythology, as we promised at the end of the Spring Heel Jack episode, and we're going back to the Western world. We are going back to ancient Greece.
Which I am very much looking forward to.
Yep, me too, certainly. Okay, so to round off, folks, I'd like to say thank you all for listening today, and I'd like to finish by plugging my Twitter account at twitter.com/the_histocrat. Follow me there to find out more about when new episodes are going to be released, what I'm generally working on, and other news about the wider Histocrat channel. In addition, this channel is also running a small Patreon at patreon.com/thehistocrat, so feel free to check us out over there if you want to help support the show. And in addition, if you're listening to this over on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where you can find this under Mythological, you can also come over to the YouTube channel at youtube.com/thehistocrat and check out video aids and see some example images of the things we've been talking about over the course of today's episode. So, Crofty, what's the final word?
Sayonara?
Indeed. Goodbye, folks.